It was just after second period when the intercom crackled, the static sharp and jarring against the low hum of Mrs. Blake's lecture. Attention, students and staff. Lockdown. This is not a drill. Lockdown immediately. The voice was different. Higher pitched, strained, like whoever was speaking was struggling to stay calm. The air in the classroom shifted instantly, heavy with an almost tangible tension. Mrs. Blake froze mid-sentence, the marker poised over the whiteboard. Then, as if breaking out of a trance, she dropped it, rushed to the door, and locked it. "Everyone to the back," she said, her voice shaky but firm. We moved quickly, the scrape of chairs and desks loud in the oppressive silence. I pressed myself into the farthest corner, trying to make myself as small as possible. Around me, my classmates huddled together, their knees pulled up, their faces pale. Mrs. Blake turned off the lights and crouched by the door. "Stay quiet," she whispered, barely audible over the sound of my own racing heartbeat. For a while it was just silence, heavy, suffocating silence. I could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional creak of the old school building. Then a noise, a loud bang from somewhere down the hallway. My stomach dropped. It could have been a door slamming, but in that moment, all I could think about was the possibility of a gunshot. Someone stifled a gasp, and I pressed my back harder against the cold wall. That's when I noticed Lauren. She was sitting a few feet from me, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Her brown hair fell across her face, but I could see her shoulders trembling. Her lips moved silently, as though she were repeating something to herself. At first I thought she was praying. Then I realised her whispers weren't words, they were just sounds. Panic. Pure, unfiltered panic. "Lauren," I whispered as softly as I could. "You okay?" She didn't respond. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, and her eyes darted to the windows, wide and unblinking. I wanted to reach out to her, but I didn't know how. Another bang, this time closer. Someone let out a muffled sob. Lauren flinched violently, her whole body jerking as though she'd been struck. "It's happening," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's him." "Who?" I whispered, but she didn't answer. Suddenly Lauren shot to her feet. "Lauren!" Mrs. Blake hissed from across the room. But Lauren wasn't listening. She stumbled toward the window, her movements frantic and disjointed. The heavy pane rattled as she shoved it upward, the wind rushing into the room. "Lauren, stop!" Mrs. Blake's voice was sharp now, almost pleading. But Lauren didn't stop. She climbed onto the ledge, balancing there for a fraction of a second. Her face was pale, her eyes glazed over with terror. Then she jumped. The sound of her body hitting the ground below was muffled by the wind, but it was loud enough to make my stomach turn. The room erupted into chaos. Someone screamed. Mrs. Blake ran to the door, unlocking it with trembling hands and bolting into the hallway. I couldn't move. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. A few minutes later, the intercom crackled again. "The lockdown has been lifted. Repeat, the lockdown has been lifted. There is no active threat." No active threat. I stared at the speaker, the words swirling in my head. My classmates whispered in hushed, frantic tones. Someone started crying. I crawled to the window and looked down. Lauren was lying on the grass, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. Paramedics arrived quickly. They carried her away on a stretcher, her face pale but alive. Mrs. Blake returned a while later, her face ashen. She told us to pack up our things and go home. The next day, rumours started to spread. It had been a prank. Someone thought it would be funny to call in a fake report of an active shooter. They'd hacked into the intercom system and sent the entire school into chaos. But for Lauren, it wasn't just a prank. Later I learned more about her. People whispered about her father, about the shouting that neighbours heard late at night, about the bruises she tried to hide beneath long sleeves. The lockdown had triggered something deep inside her, a fear she couldn't control, a memory she couldn't escape. Lauren survived, but everything changed. She broke her arm and her leg, but she survived. After the incident, the government intervened, and she was taken into protective custody. Her father was arrested for child abuse, accusations that had been lurking in the shadows, unspoken but undeniable. The school held assemblies and offered counselling, but none of it felt like enough. A heavy silence hung over everything, an unspoken understanding that this was bigger than anyone wanted to admit. I can't stop thinking about that moment, when she stood on the ledge, her face a mask of terror, and jumped. It plays in my mind like a movie I can't turn off, a prank they called it. But for Lauren, it was so much more. For all of us it was, and the person responsible for that prank was never caught. I'll never forget that day, though I wish I could. Back then I was angry at everything, at the guys who picked on me during lunch, at my teachers for not noticing, and at my parents for not caring enough. The world felt like it was against me, and I wanted to take some of that power back. So I did something stupid. I took one of the kitchen knives from home. Nothing huge, just a simple blade that I could slip into my bag without anyone noticing. I didn't plan to use it. Honestly, I didn't even want to hurt anyone. I just wanted to scare them, to make them feel the way I did every day. Small, powerless, afraid. I remember standing in the bathroom that morning staring at my reflection. My hands were shaking as I zipped up my bag. A voice in my head kept saying, "Don't do this," but I ignored it. The school day felt like a blur. I didn't pull out the knife or say anything to anyone. I just kept telling myself that I'd find the right moment. Maybe during lunch when the jocks made their stupid jokes, or in class when the teacher ignored me like always. But then everything changed. I was walking through the hallway near the cafeteria when I decided to cut through the kitchen. It was quieter there, and I needed a moment to collect myself. That's when I saw him. A man I didn't recognise stood above Mr. Harris, a gun clenched in his trembling hand. His chest heaved with each ragged breath, and his face twisted into something monstrous. Rage, pain, desperation, all tangled together. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but I couldn't move. My legs were rooted to the floor, my body frozen in place. My mind screamed at me to move, to hide, but I couldn't even blink. Then his head snapped toward me, and our eyes met. In that moment I was certain I was going to die. But he didn't shoot. Instead he raised a finger to his lips, his eyes burning with a silent command. Stay quiet. Then, as quickly as he'd appeared, he was gone, disappearing through the back door. I stood there trembling, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. My knees buckled and I nearly collapsed. That's when the alarm blared. Attention, students and staff. Lockdown. This is not a drill. Lockdown, immediately. The words echoed through the school, cold and mechanical. My first thought wasn't about Mr. Harris or the man with the gun, it was about me. They knew. They must have known what I'd planned. Panic surged through me like ice in my veins. I clutched my bag tightly, feeling the shape of the knife inside, and ran to the nearest classroom. I slipped inside just as the teacher locked the door, throwing myself into a corner. My hands shook so badly that I couldn't even unzip my bag to confirm the knife was still there. The room was silent, except for the muffled sobs of a few students. The teacher sat by the door, pale and rigid, holding a pair of scissors as if they could stand against a bullet. And then we heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Each step felt like a countdown. They grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside our door. I felt warmth run down my leg and realised, with shame, that I'd wet myself. My body betrayed me as I sat there, too terrified to cry, to breathe, to do anything but wait. The handle didn't move. The door didn't burst open. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps continued down the hallway, fading into silence. Even when the all clear was announced, I couldn't move. The teacher had to gently shake me, whispering that it was safe. But I didn't feel safe. Not then. Not ever again. Later I learned the man was the ex-boyfriend of one of the cafeteria workers. His jealousy had consumed him, and in his rage, he'd blamed Mr. Harris for something that probably wasn't even true. The police caught him before he left the building, but not before he took an innocent man's life. I said nothing to anyone about the knife in my bag or what I'd planned to do with it. I threw it away that night, burying it deep in the trash so I wouldn't be tempted to take it back. That day I came face to face with the fragility of life, how easily it could be snuffed out by anger or fear. I'd been so consumed by my own pain, my own selfishness, that I'd forgotten what truly mattered. People, connections, the the gift of being alive. I thought I understood fear, but I didn't know the first thing about it. Fear wasn't what I'd carried with me before. It was seeing Mr. Harris lying in his own blood. It was the sound of those footsteps outside the classroom. It was realising how quickly and carelessly lives could be destroyed, how mine could have ended too. Some nights I still wake up gasping, haunted by the image of Mr. Harris's smile fading into a pool of crimson. But I carry the lesson with me. Life is fragile, precious, and deserving of respect. And so are the people who share it with us. My name's Daniels. It's been 10 years since that day, but I still think about it sometimes. The sound of that alarm, the look in Greg's eyes, it's all burned into my memory. I suppose I should start by telling you a bit about myself. I've always been the kind of guy who blends into the background. Easygoing, unremarkable, just another face in the crowd. Back when this all happened, my life was pretty simple. No wife, no kids, no glamorous job. I worked as a security guard at my old high school, walking the same halls where I once endured mind-numbing lectures, and was always the last pick in gym class. It wasn't much, but it was my routine. It wasn't a bad life, but it wasn't a good one either. It was just routine. That day started like any other. I was making my rounds, walking through the east wing near the science labs. The hallways were quiet, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. I was thinking about lunch, whether I'd stick with the turkey sandwich I'd packed or grab something hot from the cafeteria, when the intercom crackled to life. Attention students and staff. Lockdown. This is not a drill. Lockdown immediately. The words hit me like a punch. In my years as a security guard, we'd done plenty of drills, but this wasn't one of them. My stomach tightened as I grabbed my radio, fumbling to press the button. "This is Daniels," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's going on?" The response came back, clipped and tense. "Possible intruder. Armed. Last seen near the gym." The gym was on the other side of the building. I turned to head that way when I heard a faint creak behind me. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly I turned, my flashlight already in my hand. At first I didn't see anything. The hallway was dim, lit only by the sunlight streaming through the windows. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone step out of the shadows. It was Greg. I hadn't seen him in years, but I recognised him instantly. We'd been friends back in high school, two skinny kids who didn't fit in. We ate lunch together in the corner of the cafeteria, spent afternoons in detention, and shared a mutual hatred for the bullies who made our lives hell. "Greg," I said, lowering the flashlight slightly. He stared at me, his face pale and gaunt. For a moment he didn't say anything. Then he let out a bitter laugh. "Daniels," he said, "of all people." "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice cautious. Greg shifted, and that's when I saw it, the gun in his hand. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Greg, what's going on?" He shrugged, the movement jerky. "What do you think? I'm here to set things right." "Set things right?" Greg laughed again, the sound sharp and hollow. "Yeah, you know what it's like. We were nothing to them. They treated us like garbage, Daniels, like we didn't matter. And now look at us, you're a security guard." He gestured to himself, his voice cracking. "We're still nobodies. Nothing's changed." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. "Greg, listen to me," I said, my voice steady. "I get it, I do, but this isn't the way. This won't fix anything." "Won't it?" he snapped. "They deserve it, Daniels, all of them. After everything they did to us, you're telling me they don't." "They don't," I said softly. "What happened to us wasn't their fault. Life's hard, man. It doesn't give most people much. But you can't blame them for that." Greg stared at me, his jaw tight. His hand was shaking now, the gun trembling in his grip. "Put it down," I said, taking a small step forward. "Please." For a long, agonising moment, we just stood there. Then slowly, Greg lowered the gun. The sound of boots pounding down the hallway broke the silence. Police officers rounded the corner, their weapons drawn. "Drop the weapon," one of them shouted. Greg froze. He let the gun fall to the floor, and sank to his knees. The officers moved in, cuffing him and leading him away. I stayed behind, leaning against the wall, my legs too weak to hold me up. That night I couldn't stop thinking about Greg, about the bitterness in his voice, the anger in his eyes. We'd both suffered, both been hurt, but we'd made different choices. That day, I decided I couldn't keep living the way I was. I couldn't let myself get stuck in the past, blaming the world for what I didn't have. I signed up for a carpentry class a few weeks later. It was something I'd always wanted to try, but I'd never made the effort. That's where I met Lisa. She was funny, sharp, and had the kind of laugh that made you feel warm inside. We hit it off right away, and a few years later, we got married. Now 10 years later, I can honestly say I'm happy. Life still isn't perfect, but I've learned to focus on the things that matter, the things that make life worth living. Greg taught me that, in a way. It's not the world's fault when life doesn't give you what you want. And it's not other people's fault either. You've got to find your own way forward. It was supposed to be an exciting day. My wife and I had planned a family trip for weeks, and I'd taken the afternoon off work to pick up our son Caleb, a little early from school. He was thrilled. He'd been talking about it all week, counting down the days until we could hit the road. I remember pulling into the parking lot of his elementary school, feeling a little rush of pride. Caleb was 8, full of energy, and absolutely obsessed with soccer. He had just made the school team, and every time I looked at him in that little uniform, I couldn't help but smile. The parking lot was quiet, with only a few cars scattered here and there. I had arrived early, beating the usual rush of parents and buses. I parked the car and headed inside, expecting to find Caleb waiting in the office, his backpack slung over his shoulder. But he wasn't there. "Hi, I'm here to pick up Caleb Sanders," I said to the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. She frowned, glancing down at her computer. "He's not here yet," she said. "Let me call his classroom." I leaned against the counter, checking my watch. We had plenty of time to make the drive, but I was eager to get going. The receptionist made the call, her voice calm and professional. But then her expression changed. "He's not there?" she asked, her brow furrowing. She glanced up at me, her face tightening with something that looked like concern. "Are you sure?" A knot formed in my stomach. She hung up and gave me a forced smile. "Let me check with the gym. Caleb has soccer practice after school, doesn't he?" "Yeah," I said slowly, my voice feeling oddly distant. She made another call, this time to the gym teacher. I tried to listen, but the words blurred together, muffled by the pounding of my pulse in my ears. Finally, she hung up. "He's not in the gym either," she said, her voice quieter now. "Maybe he's in the locker room," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Or the field. He might have lost track of time." The receptionist nodded, but her smile was gone now. "Let me check with the principal," she said. "Stay here." She disappeared down the hall, leaving me standing there, the knot in my stomach tightening with every passing second. I told myself it was nothing. Caleb was probably fine. Kids wander off all the time. But the longer I waited, the harder it became to believe that. Then the alarm blared. "Attention students and staff. Lockdown. This is not a drill. Lockdown immediately." The announcement sent a chill down my spine. I looked around, but the office was suddenly deserted. The receptionist hadn't come back yet, and I was alone. My first thought was Caleb. My second thought was that the lockdown was somehow connected to him. I stepped into the hallway, ignoring the voice in my head telling me to stay put. The school felt eerie, empty and quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. I made my way toward the gym, my steps quickening with every turn. "Caleb," I called softly, my voice echoing down the empty hallway. No answer. When I reached the gym, the doors were locked. I banged on them, the noise sharp and jarring in the silence. "Hello, is anyone in there?" Still no answer. I turned toward the locker rooms, my heart pounding. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, the hinges squeaking loudly. "Caleb?" I called again. The room was empty, the rows of lockers casting long shadows under the dim lights. I stepped inside, the air cold and heavy. Something felt wrong. That's when I saw it. Caleb's backpack lying on the bench. My stomach dropped. "Caleb!" I yelled, my voice breaking. No response. I grabbed the backpack, clutching it tightly as my mind raced. He wouldn't leave it behind, not Caleb. He loved that bag. It had his favourite soccer patches sewn onto it. Before I could think of what to do next, a hand gripped my shoulder. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. It was the principal, her face pale and tight with worry. "Mr. Sanders," she said, her voice low. "We need to talk." The next few minutes felt like a blur. She led me to a small conference room where a police officer was waiting. They told me that Caleb was missing, that no one had seen him for at least an hour. The words hit me like a freight train. They asked me if Caleb had mentioned anything unusual, if he'd been upset about anything, if he'd talked about anyone at school. I shook my head, my mind struggling to process what they were saying. Then the principal hesitated, her eyes flicking to the officer. "There's something else," she said carefully. "The soccer coach. Mr. Doyle. He's missing too." The name hit me like a second blow. Mr. Doyle, Caleb's coach. The man who'd encouraged him to join the team, who always gave him extra tips during practice. I'd liked him, trusted him. The officer explained that they'd found Caleb's cleats in Doyle's car, parked near the back entrance of the school. My blood ran cold. The rest of the day was a nightmare. The police issued an alert searching for Caleb and Mr. Doyle. Hours passed like years, every second stretching unbearably. It wasn't until late that night that they found them. Doyle had taken Caleb to an abandoned house a few miles away. The police arrived just in time, rescuing Caleb before anything worse could happen. When I finally saw him, I pulled him into my arms and didn't let go. It's been years since that day, but the fear hasn't left me. Knowing how close I came to losing him, it's something I carry with me every day. Caleb doesn't talk about it much. He's older now, a teenager with his own life, but I can tell he remembers. It's in the way he avoids certain people, the way he clings to the things that make him feel safe. As for me, I've learned to hold him a little tighter, to never take the small moments for granted, because life can change in an instant, and some shadows never fully fade. My name is Ms. Claire, though most people just call me Claire now. I haven't taught in over 2 years, and I doubt I ever will again. Today I'm sharing this because my therapist says it might help. Maybe she's right, though I can't see how reliving the worst day of my life is supposed to bring me any peace. I used to teach English at a local high school. It was a good school, with bright students and a staff that cared. But all of that changed on an ordinary Tuesday in April. The morning had started like any other. I was in room 213, finishing a lesson on metaphor and symbolism. I remember writing on the whiteboard, hearing the usual shuffle of papers and murmurs from my students. Some were paying attention, some weren't. It was a normal day, and then the intercom blared. "Attention, students and staff. Lockdown. This is not a drill. Lockdown immediately." The tone of the announcement was sharp, panicked. I froze for a moment, the marker in my hand hovering mid-air. "Everyone to the corner now," I said, my voice shaking but firm. The students scrambled out of their seats, their desks screeching against the floor. I locked the door, turned off the lights and pulled the blinds. My hands were trembling, but I tried to stay calm for the kids. "Quiet," I whispered, as they huddled together in the corner of the room. Some of them were crying, their faces pale with fear. I didn't know what was happening, but the tension in the air was suffocating. I pressed myself against the wall, listening intently. Then we heard it, the first gunshot. It echoed down the hallway, loud and jarring, followed by screams. My heart felt like it stopped. I glanced at my students, their terrified faces etched into my memory. They were just kids. More shots followed, closer this time. I didn't know where they were coming from or how far away the shooter was. All I could do was pray that the door would hold. And then the footsteps began. Heavy, deliberate, and coming straight for our room. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the shooter could hear it. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. The handle jiggled. Some of the students let out muffled cries and I pressed a finger to my lips, trying to keep them quiet. The door rattled violently and then came the gunshots. The first bullet shattered the lock and the door swung open. The shooter stepped inside, his face twisted in rage. He was holding a shotgun, the barrel gleaming under the fluorescent lights. It was Mr. Jennings, the father of one of my students, Ethan. I recognised him instantly. "Where are they?" he shouted, his voice filled with fury. None of us moved. None of us spoke. "Where are they?" he screamed again, firing a shot into the ceiling. I didn't understand at first. Then it hit me. He was looking for the kids who had hurt Ethan. Ethan had been the victim of a cruel prank, one that had left him physically and emotionally shattered. The boys responsible had tied him up in the locker room as a joke. Something went wrong, and Ethan was left permanently injured. He suffered severe injuries that left him partially disabled in ways that deeply affected his manhood. Afterward, he withdrew completely, no longer speaking, barely acknowledging others, and retreating into a silent, unresponsive shell. And now his father was here for revenge. "I know you're in here," Jennings yelled, his voice breaking. I stepped forward, my hands trembling. "Mr. Jennings," I said, my voice shaking, "please don't do this. These kids—" He didn't let me finish. The next thing I knew, there was a flash of light, a deafening sound, and a searing pain in my side. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. My body was a patchwork of stitches and scars. My ribs felt like they were on fire, and my head was pounding. It wasn't until days later that I learned the full extent of what had happened. Mr. Jennings had killed 10 students and injured 5 teachers before the police took him down. He was shot and killed in a standoff just outside the school cafeteria. I survived by some miracle, though I spent 6 months in the hospital recovering. The physical wounds healed eventually, but the mental scars, they're still fresh. I haven't been back to the school since that day. I couldn't bring myself to face the memories, the ghosts that haunt those hallways, until today. My therapist said it might help to revisit the classroom, to confront what happened instead of running from it. So here I am, standing in room 213, staring at the corner where my students once huddled in fear. The walls have been repainted, the desks rearranged, but it doesn't matter. I can still see their faces, still hear their cries. I don't know if sharing this will help. Maybe it'll ease the guilt I've been carrying. Guilt for surviving when so many didn't. Guilt for not being able to stop him. But if nothing else, I hope it serves as a reminder. A reminder of how quickly life can change, of how devastating unchecked anger and pain can be, and of how we must do better for our children. My name is Anna Parker, and what I'm about to share happened years ago, long before school shootings became something anyone could imagine, let alone prepare for. Back then, the idea of sending your child to school and not having them come home was unthinkable. Tyler was 12 years old when it happened, my sweet, curious boy on the cusp of his teenage years. He loved soccer, video games, and telling me jokes he'd read in books or heard from his friends. He was at that age where he still wanted a hug every morning, but would roll his eyes if I tried to kiss him in front of his classmates. That morning started like any other. I remember standing in the kitchen, pouring coffee while Tyler wolfed down a bowl of cereal. He was wearing his favourite hoodie, the one with the faded logo of his soccer team, and his backpack was slung haphazardly over one shoulder. "Mum, do you think I'll get picked for first team today?" he asked, his voice hopeful. "Of course you will," I said, smiling. "Coach Miller knows how hard you've been practicing." He grinned at me, his face lighting up in a way that made my chest ache with love. "Thanks, Mum. Love you." "Love you too, kiddo," I said as he headed out the door, his sneakers squeaking against the hardwood floor. I had no idea that would be the last time I'd hear those words from him. The day unfolded normally at first. I was at work, going through emails and planning my afternoon meetings, when my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a call from the school. "Ms. Parker, this is Valley View Middle," the voice on the other end said, tense and hurried. "We wanted to inform you that the school is currently on lockdown." My stomach tightened. "Lockdown? Why?" "There's been an incident. I don't have all the details, but the authorities are here, and the building is secure. Please stay where you are, and we'll update you as soon as possible." "What kind of incident?" I asked, my voice rising. The woman hesitated. "I'm sorry, that's all I can tell you right now. We'll be in touch soon." She hung up before I could press her further. I sat there, frozen, my hand gripping the phone so tightly, my knuckles turned white. An incident? What did that even mean? I grabbed my coat and rushed out the door, my thoughts racing as I drove to the school. The closer I got, the heavier the traffic became, police cars and ambulances speeding past me with their lights flashing. When I finally arrived, the parking lot was a chaotic mess of vehicles and frantic parents. I parked as close as I could and ran toward the crowd gathered outside the school gates. "Tyler Parker!" I shouted, pushing my way through the throng. "Has anyone seen my son? Tyler Parker!" No one answered me. Parents were crying, shouting, clutching their phones as they called family members. The tension in the air was suffocating, every passing second stretching into an eternity. An officer near the entrance was speaking to the crowd, his voice calm but firm. "We're working to secure the situation. Please remain patient. We'll provide updates as soon as we can." "Where's my son?" I demanded, stepping closer. "Tyler Parker. He's 12. The officer glanced at his clipboard, his expression tightening. "I don't have any information on individual students yet, Ma'am," he said. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. Minutes passed, then an hour. Every now and then a group of students emerged from the building, escorted by police. Parents rushed forward, hugging their children, crying with relief. But Tyler wasn't among them. Then I saw the stretchers, a line of them, covered in white sheets, being wheeled out one by one. My breath caught, and my legs felt like they might give out. "No," I whispered to myself. "No, no, no." I pushed through the crowd, ignoring the officer who tried to stop me. My hands were trembling as I approached the stretchers, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. "Tyler," I called, my voice breaking. "Tyler!" My hands trembled as I reached for the first sheet. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat before pulling it back. Not him. Relief flooded me for a fleeting moment, but it was quickly replaced by dread as I moved to the next one. "Please, no," I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice over the pounding of my heart. My vision blurred with tears, and my knees felt weak as I grabbed the edge of the second sheet. Every fibre of my being screamed to stop, to turn away, to leave this nightmare behind. But I had to know. I had to see. I pulled it back, and there he was. Tyler, my beautiful boy. His face was so pale, so heartbreakingly still, his eyes closed as though he were only sleeping. But the blood, staining his hoodie, streaking his delicate hands, it told a story I couldn't bear to face. My legs gave out beneath me and I crumpled to the floor. "Tyler!" I screamed, the word tearing from my throat like a jagged blade. "No, no, no, no!" I reached for him, my fingers brushing against his cold skin, but he didn't stir. My boy, my baby, gone. The weight of it crushed me, a tidal wave of anguish that I knew I would never escape. Someone tried to pull me away, but I clung to him, refusing to let go. "Mom," a voice said gently, but I couldn't hear them over the sound of my own grief. Eventually I felt arms around me, guiding me away from the stretcher. I collapsed into the arms of a stranger, my body racked with uncontrollable sobs. It wasn't until later that I learned what had happened. The shooter was a former student, a teenager with a grudge against the school. He'd walked into the cafeteria during lunch and opened fire, killing 7 students and injuring many more before turning the gun on himself. Tyler had been sitting with his friends, laughing over their meals, completely unaware of the danger. He never stood a chance. It's been years since that day, but the pain hasn't faded. Every morning I wake up and reach for a boy who isn't there. Every night I dream of him walking through the door, his backpack slung over his shoulder, his grin as bright as ever. People say time heals all wounds, but that's not true. Time doesn't heal. It just teaches you how to live with the pain. I'll never forget the sound of Tyler's laugh, the feel of his arms around my waist when he hugged me, or the last words he ever said to me. "Love you, Mum." At least he knew I loved him. At least he knew. My grandfather rarely spoke about his childhood. He grew up in a quiet, rural town surrounded by fields and silence, where life moved slower, and the most excitement came from the occasional fair or town meeting. But when he did talk about it, there was one story he shared, Just once, and only because I begged him to tell me why he hated the sound of lockdown alarms. It was the day my school disappeared, he said, his voice distant. He was 14 at the time, a skinny kid with a mop of messy brown hair and a knack for getting into trouble. His school was a tiny one-storey building with about 50 students, all of them crammed into classrooms with creaking floors and chalkboards that had seen better days. It was mid-morning on a chilly fall day when the announcement came over the intercom. The system had only been installed a few weeks earlier, and most of the teachers still didn't fully understand how to use it. The voice on the speaker was nervous, shaky. Teachers, lock your doors. Students, stay in your classrooms. This is a lockdown." The words hung in the air, unfamiliar and unsettling. Back then, no one practiced lockdowns. Most people didn't even know what the word meant. My grandfather's teacher, Mrs. Adams, looked confused for a moment before springing into action. "All right, everyone, to the corner," she said, her voice tight. "Stay quiet. This won't take long." They didn't know what to expect. They didn't know why they were doing it. They just sat there in silence, huddled together, while the old radiator clanged faintly in the background. The minutes crawled by, each one heavier than the last. Then, faintly, they heard it. A low thump, distant but ominous. "What was that?" a girl whispered, her voice trembling. Mrs. Adams shushed her, her eyes darting toward the door. The lockdown dragged on, and the silence in the room became unbearable. My grandfather said he didn't understand what was happening, but he could feel the tension growing. When the voice on the intercom finally returned, it was shaky but relieved. "The lockdown is over. Teachers, please evacuate the students to the parking lot." The relief in the room was immediate. Kids stood too quickly, their chairs scraping against the floor as they filed out into the hallway. My grandfather followed, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. No one knew what had happened, but at least they were getting out. They made it outside to the parking lot, where the crisp fall air felt sharp against his skin. The teachers were herding students into small groups, trying to keep things orderly. My grandfather was standing with his friends, glancing back at the school when it happened. An explosion. He didn't even recognise the sound at first. It wasn't like anything he'd ever heard before. A roar so loud it drowned out the world, followed by a wave of heat that knocked him to the ground. When he scrambled to his feet, he turned to see the school, consumed by fire and smoke. It took him a moment to process what he was seeing. The building had collapsed in on itself, and debris was still raining down. The air was filled with screams, some from students, others from the adults realising what had just happened. But not everyone had made it out. Some teachers and students had been slower to evacuate, still inside when the bomb detonated. The rest of the day passed in a blur. My grandfather and his father returned home, shaken and silent. But it wasn't long before they got answers. The police came to their house that evening. His father was the leader of the local community, a kind of unofficial mayor, and the officers thought he needed to know the details before the town learned. My grandfather overheard everything as he sat quietly in the corner, too scared to interrupt. The police explained that the explosion had been a deliberate attack. A group of men had planted a bomb in the school basement to cause chaos and distract the town. While the town's attention was on the school, the men had broken into the local bank. But here's the part that chilled my grandfather to the bone. The bank barely had any money. It was a small town vault with just enough cash to cover the local businesses. They'd killed teachers, kids, and destroyed an entire school for almost nothing. That's when I realised how cruel people could be, my grandfather told me, his voice cracking. They didn't care who they hurt. They didn't even think about it. The men were eventually caught, but that didn't bring back the people who died. The school was never rebuilt, and the town struggled to recover. My grandfather said he couldn't bring himself to go back to a classroom after that day. The thought of being in a building, trapped, with nowhere to go if something went wrong, it was too much. Even now, years later, he can still hear the explosion. And every time he hears the word lockdown, it sends him back to that day, the day everything in his world fell apart. It's been 2 years since it happened, and not a day goes by when I don't think about her. The flashes of light through the blinds, the muffled screams, the shadowed figure in the hallway. It all plays on a loop in my head. And what's worse, I know who she was, and I know who he was too. That day had started like any other. Third period biology was dragging on, and I was only half listening to Mr. Lawson talk about mitosis. My desk was at the back of the room, the perfect spot for doodling in my notebook without anyone noticing. The intercom crackled to life, breaking the monotony. "This is a lockdown. Teachers, lock your doors immediately. Students, remain silent." The principal's voice sounded oddly stiff, like she was struggling to stay calm. Mr. Lawson froze for a second, his mouth still open mid-sentence, before he snapped into action. He locked the door, pulled the blinds shut, and told us to get to the back of the room. We huddled there, knees pressed to our chests, the air thick with tension. Someone whispered, "It's probably just a drill." But we all knew it wasn't. Drills were announced in advance, and they didn't feel like this. The minutes crawled by, each one heavier than the last. Then came the footsteps. They were faint at first, slow and deliberate, echoing through the hallway. My heart started pounding, the sound filling my ears. I felt frozen in place, like if I moved, whoever was out there would know. And then I heard it, a faint, muffled sob. I didn't mean to look. I knew the rules, to stay hidden, to stay silent. But my curiosity got the better of me. I shifted slightly, peering through the slats of the blinds. That's when I saw her. Her name was Maria. She was a freshman, shy and quiet, the kind of girl who seemed to blend into the background. I didn't know her well, but I'd seen her sitting alone in the cafeteria, headphones in, sketching in a little notebook. She always wore bright colours, and that day was no different. A yellow hoodie that stood out like a beacon in the dim hallway. Maria was crouched near the lockers, her shoulders trembling. She must have been in the bathroom when the lockdown started. Maybe she tried to run back to class and got stuck in the hallway. Either way, she was alone, and she wasn't the only one there. At the far end of the hallway stood a man. He wasn't much older than us, maybe 20, with messy dark hair and a face half hidden by the hood of his sweatshirt. His name was David. David had gone to our school years before, back when my brother was still a senior. He wasn't popular or athletic, just a quiet kid who always seemed to sit by himself in the library. People said he was smart, but also strange. He talked to himself sometimes, and he didn't have many friends. After graduation, he'd fallen off the radar. No one really knew what happened to him. But the rumours spread. His family had fallen apart, his mum left, and he couldn't hold a job. I didn't know if any of it was true, but it didn't matter now. Because now David was standing there, a gun in his hand. He didn't move at first. He just stood there, staring at Emily like he was waiting for something. I could see the fear in her face, the way her wide eyes darted around the hallway, looking for an escape. Then he started walking, slowly, deliberately, each step echoing like a hammer against my chest. Maria tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. Her trembling hands pressed against the lockers, her yellow hoodie stark against the cold grey metal. "Please," she whimpered, her voice barely audible. David stopped a few feet away, tilting his head to the side. "You don't even know my name, do you?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp. Emily shook her head, her breath hitching. "No one does," he muttered, almost to himself. "I went to this school, I walked these halls, but I was invisible." "Please," Maria repeated, tears streaming down her face. David's hand tightened around the gun. "I just wanted someone to notice," he said, his voice cracking. And then it happened. I couldn't see everything through the blinds, just flashes. The way Maria raised her hands as if to shield herself. The sound of the gunshot echoing down the hallway. The bright red spreading across her hoodie. I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the desk so hard it hurt. I wanted to scream, to do something, but I couldn't move. When the lockdown finally ended, the hallway was chaos. Police swarmed the building, and students were evacuated in tight, terrified groups. Maria was gone. Later we learned that David had been planning it for weeks. He hadn't chosen Emily specifically. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He wasn't there to hurt everyone, just to confront the world that had ignored him for so long. But in his twisted way, he thought making someone pay attention meant taking something away. Something precious. Something irreplaceable. I tell myself there was nothing I could have done. that opening the door would have put everyone in my class in danger, that I was just a kid and it wasn't my job to stop him. But those thoughts don't help, because every time I close my eyes, I see Maria, yellow hoodie, bright and vibrant in the shadows, and I hear her voice trembling and desperate. And all I can think is, I could have done something, but I didn't. It was one of those days where the air felt heavy, like something bad was about to happen. I couldn't explain it then, and even now, it's hard to put into words. But as I walked into school that morning, I felt it. A knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. Our school wasn't very big, but it had a strange layout. The main building was shaped like an L, and at the far end of one wing, there was a section that was mostly unused. They called it the empty wing, though it wasn't completely abandoned. A few old classrooms were used for storage, and the janitor's closet was back there. Most of us avoided it. It was cold, the lights flickered constantly, and the air always smelled faintly of mildew. That day, fourth period had just started when the lockdown alarm went off. "This is a lockdown. Teachers, lock your doors immediately." Students remained silent. The voice on the intercom sounded rushed, almost panicked. My math teacher, Miss Grant, froze for a moment, before locking the door and shutting the blinds. "Everyone, to the corner," she whispered, motioning for us to huddle behind her desk. The room fell into an uneasy silence. I could hear the muffled sounds of doors slamming and footsteps in the hallway as other teachers secured their classrooms. But after that, it was quiet. Too quiet. Minutes turned into what felt like hours, and the tension in the room grew unbearable. That's when I heard it. A faint sound like shuffling footsteps coming from the hallway. It was subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss, but it got louder, closer, until it was just outside our door. Everyone held their breath. The sound stopped, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Then slowly the doorknob started to turn. My heart felt like it was about to explode. The lock held, and after a moment the knob stopped moving. Whoever was out there didn't try to force it open. Instead, the footsteps continued, heading farther down the hall, toward the empty wing. I don't know what compelled me to move. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fear, but I shifted slightly, just enough to peek through the edge of the blinds. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I caught a glimpse of him. A man tall and thin, wearing dark clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He was carrying something in his hand, but it wasn't clear what it was. He moved slowly, deliberately, disappearing around the corner toward the empty wing. "Did you see something?" my friend Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. We stayed there, frozen in place, until the lockdown finally ended. The principal's voice came over the intercom, telling us it was safe to leave. But something about her tone didn't feel reassuring. As we filed out of the classroom, I glanced toward the hallway leading to the empty wing. A group of police officers was gathered there, their faces grim. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape, and students were being steered away. Rumours spread quickly. Some said the man had been hiding in one of the old classrooms, waiting for the right moment. Others claimed he'd gotten in through an unlocked door in the janitor's closet. But the truth didn't come out until later that day, when the school sent out an official statement. The man had been armed. He'd made his way into the empty wing and tried to set up some kind of trap. Explosives, they said, but he'd left before finishing, either because the police arrived or because something spooked him. He was never caught. For weeks I couldn't stop thinking about that moment when the doorknob turned. If he'd chosen our classroom instead of the empty wing, things could have ended differently. And every time I walk past that part of the school, I feel it. The cold air, the flickering lights, and the faint smell of mildew. But mostly I feel the weight of what could have been. I still remember the sound of the gunshot. That single deafening crack echoed through the hallways, shattering the kind of quiet that only exists in schools during a lockdown. I wasn't in the room when it happened. I was 2 doors down, huddled with my class, praying we'd get through it unharmed. But every detail of that day is seared into my memory, not because of what I saw, but because of what he did. His name was David Turner. Back then he was just Mr. Turner, the history teacher who always stayed late to help students study or rehearse their debate arguments. He wasn't even supposed to be at school that day. He had a dentist appointment in the morning and had been cleared to take the whole day off. But being David, he decided to come in anyway. "Can't let the kids slack off," he'd joked to me in the teacher's lounge earlier. I'd laughed and told him he worked too hard. I had no idea what he'd end up doing that day. The lockdown started during lunch. The announcement crackled over the intercom, the principal's voice trembling. "This is a lockdown. Teachers, secure your rooms immediately. Students, remain silent." I rushed to lock my door, herding the students to the corner of the room. Some of them were crying, others whispering frantically, but I tried to stay calm for their sake. That's when I heard it, the sound of yelling coming from David's classroom. At first, I thought it was just students panicking, but then over the muffled noise, I heard his voice, sharp and commanding. "Put it down." The words were clear and full of authority, but there was something in his tone, a kind of desperation that made my heart race. Then came the sound of a struggle, I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear more. I could make out scuffling, something heavy hitting the floor, and then a muffled scream. My students were staring at me, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. I wanted to reassure them, but I didn't have the words. Later, I found out what happened in those moments. David had been eating lunch in his classroom when he noticed one of his students, a quiet boy named Eric, lingering near the back of the room. Eric had his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie, his posture stiff and awkward. "Eric, you okay?" David had asked, standing up from his desk. That's when he saw it, the glint of metal in Eric's hand. A gun. David didn't hesitate. He stepped between Eric and the rest of the students, his voice firm but calm. "Eric, put it down. You don't want to do this." Eric's face was pale, his eyes darting around the room. He looked scared, terrified even, but he didn't lower the gun. Instead, he took a step closer, raising the weapon just enough to make his intentions clear. David didn't wait for him to pull the trigger. He lunged, grabbing Eric's wrist and twisting it away from the other students. The room erupted into chaos, screams, chairs scraping against the floor, desks toppling over. The struggle was brutal. Eric fought back with everything he had, and at one point the gun went off, the bullet grazing David's shoulder. But he didn't let go. With a final burst of strength, David wrestled the gun from Eric's hand and tossed it across the room. The students, frozen with fear, watched as he pinned Eric to the ground, holding him there until the police arrived. By the time the lockdown ended and the hallways were flooded with first responders, David was sitting on the floor, his shoulder bleeding, but his expression calm. "It's over," he told the officers as they led Eric away in handcuffs. "The kids are safe." When I saw him later in the nurse's office, he was pale and clearly in pain, but he still managed to smile. "You're crazy, you know that," I said, my voice shaking as I tried to fight back tears. He shrugged, or at least he tried to. "I couldn't let them get hurt. It's my job." "No, it's not," I said, my voice breaking. "But you did it anyway." David saved everyone that day. He didn't have to be there. He could have taken the day off like he'd planned. But he was, and because of him, no one else got hurt. We started dating about a year after that day. It wasn't something I saw coming. It just happened naturally. I think going through something like that changes the way you see a person. David wasn't just a brave teacher or a quick thinker. He was kind, selfless man, and had this way of making you feel like everything would be okay, even when the world was falling apart. 5 years later, we got married. Now, he's not just my husband. He's the father of our 2 kids. And if you think he's a great teacher, you should see him as a dad. He's patient, funny, and always makes time to help with homework or read bedtime stories, even after a long day. But more than anything, David is the best kind of husband a woman could ask for. He listens, really listens, and never lets a day go by without making me feel loved. He's thoughtful in all the little ways that matter, whether it's surprising me with coffee when I've had a rough morning, or staying up late to talk when I need it. He still downplays what he did that day. "I just did what anyone would have done," he says whenever someone brings it up. But he's wrong. Not anyone would have done what he did. Only him. And every time I think about that day, I thank God he was there. Not just for the students, but for me. Because David didn't just save those kids, he changed my life too. Thank you for listening to these stories. Each one is a reminder of the fragility of our world and the shadows that can creep into even the safest of places. If you have your own chilling tales or real-life horror stories you'd like to share, send them to the email in the description below. We'd love to hear them. And remember, sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding under your bed, but the ones walking among us. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next story.